they can't let go of that branch. And I think one of the things I would encourage people is that there are plenty of branches to grab onto. And sometimes you need to take a little bit of a risk to find out what is out there to do that.
Welcome to Vet Life Reimagined. Our guest today has a distinct combination of warmth, entrepreneurial energy, and genuine depth. And his story spans farm fires to 5 practices to 5 companies. The journey of Dr. Mark Wolde shows what a veterinary career can look like when you take a risk and let go of the branch. Mark is a distinguished veterinarian in Canada with over 3 decades of experience. He has practiced in multiple countries. He built 5 veterinary practices from scratch and then helped build several companies. He is the founder of My Vet Group, a financial advisory firm for veterinary practice owners. He is also an equity partner in 5 companies spanning AI, practice innovation, and veterinary access to care. But before any of that, he was a farm kid from Ontario when a tragic event that remains etched in his mind allowed him to recognize his profound connection to animals and the people who care for them. It sent him to the Ontario Veterinary College at the University of Guelph, and he absolutely loves the veterinary profession and has been faced with very challenging personal and professional decisions. In this episode, Mark and I talk about what veterinarians consistently underestimate about their own value, why he believes the profession is at a critical inflection point with AI and technology, what contrast as the mother of clarity means for anyone navigating a career decision right now, and why he is convinced that the future of veterinary medicine belongs to the veterinarians who choose to participate in shaping it, not the ones who wait to see what will happen. Let's get to the conversation with Dr. Mark Wolde. When did you know that you were interested in veterinary medicine?
Well, as you put it, variety is the spice of life, right? And I think it's great to have some diversity. And, I think that's maybe one thing to point out right off the bat is that as veterinarians, we don't give ourselves enough credit. There's so much more that we can do than just clinical practice. And I don't want to reduce it just to clinical practice because that is still top of the heap for me. Clinical practice is where my heart still is. But we as veterinarians, as a vocation, have so much to offer in so many other ways. You're asking about my journey. Wow. And like most veterinarians, I think it just starts with, having this affinity for animals, but it wasn't like some kind of an epiphany that I came to. It wasn't like I woke up one day and go, that's it, I'm going to be a veterinarian. It didn't really happen quite like that for me. I think my journey was a little bit more organic. As I mentioned, I always had an affinity for animals. And as a young boy, my father was a carpenter. He owned our carpentry company, but he was a bit of a workaholic. So, it doesn't fall far from the tree. And one day he came up to us young kids, and I would have been about 10 at the time. My second brother would have been 8. My other brother was 6. My sister was too young, but he came up to the 3 boys and he gave us an option. He says, I've got 2 choices for you. He said, we can either move to a farm or I'll build you a swimming pool. And, and thinking that I was the wise one of the group, I turned to my brothers and I said, hey, listen, I think we should pick the farm because the farm, that's like a once in a lifetime decision. Whereas the swimming pool, that could happen anytime. Like we could potentially get a swimming pool anytime. So I convinced my brothers. And of course, we probably thought we actually had a decision in the process. And chances are we had no decision. We were probably just entertained with the decision to move to a farm. And so we did. We ended up moving to a farm. And you know what? I hedged my bets pretty good because the farm actually had a swimming pool. So we ended up getting both anyways. So it worked out pretty good. The farming life was a tough life. It's a hard-working life. As kids, even as young kids, we would get up early in the morning. We would work and do chores after hours, after school. Weekends were always very busy as well. And you know what? But it was good in the sense that it was a really, I would say, very focused family time. Family was always together. And I think my dad, that was his primary reason for making that decision, was to bring his family closer together. It was in 86 that we had a devastating fire. My brother Rod had ran from the barns towards the house, screaming that the barn was on fire. And we had one of those old bank barns. So my father and I could see the flames coming out through the hayloft windows. And we ran around the corner to the bottom floor and we started rushing animals out of the door as quickly as we could. And you have to understand, we're quite rural. So there was really nobody around, but by some saving grace, and I would even say by some kind of divine intervention, a woman had drove up the driveway and she came outside the barn doors where we were in, and there's no way she would have known that we were in there, but she started screaming that the barn is collapsing. And within seconds of my dad and I running out of the building, the whole thing imploded inwards. And I think if we were 2 seconds later, we probably both would have lost our lives that day. That was a terrible day. It was a terrible day, but it was a day that's etched in my mind. And I sometimes get a bit emotional telling the story. I told a colleague of ours this story at the OVMA, and I actually broke down crying telling the story just because, the sights and the sounds and the smells of that day were devastating. We lost over 600 animals that day. And for somebody who has an affinity for animals, it was really, really tough to deal with. But it absolutely was something that, established an even deeper connection to animals in that particular circumstance. It was a year later, I ended up working for the Metro Toronto Zoo and got a very different sort of look, as to what animal life could look like under very different circumstances. In that same year, I started my bachelor's program at the University of Guelph. And it seemed like everybody, by the way, wanted to be a veterinarian when I went to university in the bachelor's program. And I didn't really know at that point in time. However, in grade 7, I hated to read, by the way. I didn't like reading at all. And in grade 7, I had a teacher come up to me and she said, I have a novel for you that you can use for your novel report. And the name of the novel was It Shouldn't Happen to a Vet. And you'll recognize that name. That was a James Herriot book. And so that was the very first book I ever read. So of course, when I'm in university and everybody else is applying to veterinary school and I have this deep connection, this deep human animal bond, this seemed like the right place for me to go, that it was destined for me to work on the side and on behalf of these creatures that can't speak for themselves. When I graduated in 93, I ended up working for somebody in a small animal practice. And I was the typical Generation X veterinarian. I worked 60 to 70 hours a week. We did all of our own on-call. I carried a beeper with me forever and ever. My boss took a little bit of advantage of me. He would go on holidays in the summertime and I would be stuck working. I loved it. I loved it so much, Megan, that I only took 2 weeks holidays over 6 years while I was there. Yeah. And at that time, that didn't seem like much of a sacrifice because, coming from the farm and doing something that you really love and working with these patients every day and getting the reward of doing so, that wasn't really that difficult. It sounds difficult, but it really wasn't difficult. But I think a lot of us are guilty for that in our profession. I think it's one of the reasons why we struggle with work-life balance. It's harder to manage work-life balance when you do something that you're so passionate about. In 99, I moved to England, worked in England for a bit. And then I spent some time in New Zealand as well. Oh, by the way, I also did a little bit of my veterinary education at the University of Utrecht as well, back in the Netherlands. But when I came back from New Zealand, I came back to my old practice, the one that I'd only take 2 weeks vacation on. And I just kind of fell into the same trap as what I was before. So it was then that I decided I would open on my own practice. And it was in the year 2001, I remember, because I was renting. I wasn't even renting. I was staying at an old breeder's of mine, their home. So a breeder that I had worked with, a Labrador Retriever breeder, had offered their basement apartment to me to live in for free while I started my first practice. And I remember getting up early in the morning on September the 11th, and the planes had just hit the two towers. And I thought to myself, what a terrible time to open up a veterinary practice. Obviously, beyond the tragedies of what was going on there, I was also, in the midst of being concerned about, where the world was going at that point in time and what we were facing. So that's kind of when I started. I started a practice then, and then I eventually grew it to 5 practices during that period of time. That's sort of the majority of my journey. I've been involved with a number of different associations. I've been a member in good standing of VMG. I was a 2018 OVMA Award of Merit winner in that particular year. It's a profession that I'm very, very dear to.
Going back to your time in Europe, because you told me that your experience there actually was inspiration for some of the practices that you supported to build today. Yeah. So What was your experience like going around these different veterinary practices in Europe? What were you learning? What was inspiring about that?
I think the biggest mistake that a lot of people outside of our profession make, and I might include things like some of the consolidators and aggregators that are out there, is that they forget that this is a relationship business, number one. That this really is about the interaction between ourselves as veterinarians, our patients, and the humans attached to those patients. Of course, we also have amazing relationships with one another. You and I were just talking about this off screen a few minutes ago, how, there's already a kindred spirit between veterinarians when we get together. It seems like there's an immediate friendship or a collegialship of some sort that's there because there's a common ethos that we share. And so it's really, really easy, I think, for us to have these kinds of conversations. And I think we carry that with us when we go into practice. When we go into practice, we want to show that same ethos. And I suppose what's a little bit surprising about that is that we probably didn't think that that's the way it was. We probably had this expectation that, oh, I get to work with dogs and cats and puppies and kittens, and this is going to be all sort of playtime. But, as I mentioned earlier, every pet is attached to a human. And so that means we have to deal with people, the good and the bad. But I think our empathy kind of carries over. And so to answer your question more astutely, when I was in England, we had 7 practices that I was working amongst. There were 2 primary practices that I was working at. One of those 2 practices was a very interesting practice. It was basically a home that was converted into a veterinary practice, and the front door was locked. So basically, when it was your appointment, you came up to the door and you knocked on the door. And when you knocked on the door, somebody would come into the door and bring you into the veterinary practice. Of course, the practice was quite small. And the rooms were very efficient. So there was no such thing as having like a separate exam room and a separate treatment room. Everything was kind of contained into sort of 3 to 4 spaces. So it was very contained and very efficient that way. But the beauty of it was that there's hyper focus on the patient, hyper focus on the client. And what's nice about that is that it really helps to develop a stronger bond, both with the patient and the client. And it shows that you're giving them your full time and attention as well. So you were asking this question because I think you were alluding to, Royal Vet, myself and Sam Fetter were trying to create a vision for Royal Vet. And the vision for Royal Vet in particular was focused primarily on the staff and work-life balance and dealing with burnout. But we did employ that same idea on Fisher Island in Miami, which is really focused on creating that one-on-one attention for clients and making sure that patients get all the care they need in the time that they're in the practice. And there's something really special about that. I think it's one of those moments where you really get to develop a stronger and deeper bond with people.
Like, I'm envisioning someone opening the door for me, especially that home-like feeling. And it does feel very welcoming. It's someone just opened the door for me and is welcoming me into their home. That's a more intimate setting as well. So just that initial act, I was already like, oh, I already feel very invited and welcomed. Those little tweaks that we can add into what we do that makes it more welcoming and personal.
Well, it's not just welcoming to the people, right? I think it's more welcoming to the pet because that's how they experience life. They walk in through the front door of a house. It's really no different, and I think even when I opened up my second practice, my original second practice back in the day, the way I had it designed was very warm, a lot of wood within the space. It looked more like the inside of somebody's home than it did, a sort of a clinical practice with white walls and steel doors. Part of that, of course, is for the aesthetics for people, but a bigger part of that is for the comfort of the pet. When the pet walks in there, they're not really feeling like they're walking into a clinic. They probably smell like they're walking into a clinic. They're not necessarily feeling like it's this sort of quasi-sterile environment that we might think of otherwise. And I think that's important. I think it's important for them, and I think it's important for the client, and even staff members too, right? For the staff as well, when they're working in a space that has a little bit more of that serenity feel. As a matter of fact, I even had clients that would say that it feels like a spa in here. And I was like, I love that description. Thank you very much. That's a great way to feel when you're walking in here. If this place is helping you feel relaxed, then we're succeeding.
How many people can say that about going into a doctor's office?
Exactly. Exactly right.
Back to, building 5 practices, what are some of your favorite memories from that? Because I mean, that's a whole nother ballgame going from walking into someone else's practice, doing the work, leaving, although you were probably sounds like you were there enough to live there. But when you're having to make decisions and start things from scratch and actually build a business, like what were you starting to learn and remember?
Yeah, I think most veterinarians who decide to own their own practice, there's a very good motivation. That motivation is your personal autonomy as a veterinarian. And it's an opportunity to do things your way. You might be working for something, and sure, there's some base things that you agree upon, but there's probably some other aspects within the practice that you think, you know what, I think we can do this a little bit better. Or I'd like to really change how we approach this particular problem or this particular kind of client or this particular workflow. And the idea behind owning your own practice is to be able to employ it your way and to do it your way. And that's where a lot of the reward comes from, of course, is doing it your way and employing a particular sort of culture and ethos that you want to implement. What we don't bank on and what we forget is that it's still a business. And a business requires a different sort of mindset. There's a lot of management that goes into running this particular practice. Everything from HR resourcing to marketing to dealing with clients and client complaints, for example, staffing issues. All of these things kind of come into play. And that's a lot of stress and a lot of administration that are outside of your every clinical day. So when you ask me the question, what do you remember the most? There's a bit of organized chaos through all of that. You know what I mean? Like you're constantly running. And I found myself, doing appointments and loving that. And then really a lot of the administrative things came in between appointments. It was like any time that you had free time was the time that you fit in to do those things. But the amazing thing about this vocation is that it's both good and bad, is that because of that passion, it doesn't feel like work. And I actually was one of these people who didn't mind the administrative side of it. As a matter of fact, I pulled that into my sort of everyday routine and enjoyed doing that as well, even if it was challenging. It even got to a stage in my clinics that even when the other veterinarians were having problems with clients, I would be the one that have to go put out that fire. And I enjoyed that. I enjoyed that challenge of meeting somebody where they are, understanding their perspective, getting clarity on their complaint and trying to find a resolution. These are good skill sets to have.
Just because we have to work at something doesn't mean we're not enjoying it. Sometimes it's that gives more reward if you have to work a little bit for it. So kind of finding that balance of the challenge and then meeting the challenge.
For sure. And I think there's an interesting psychology that comes with this when we're talking about veterinarians, the psychology and the taboo of doing it successfully, right? Because I think as veterinarians, we love it so much, we probably would volunteer to do this. This is something we'd be happy to do, right? It's just like, I enjoy this so much. You're like, you don't even have to pay me. I'm good. Obviously we have to make a living. And I think that particular sentiment sometimes makes it a little bit more difficult for us to, enjoy the success of it as well. We have a hard time in the examination room making recommendations where the bill's starting to climb and kind of feeling bad about that bill, or, people who have inaccessibility to care and that sort of thing. We're always trying to find ways to meet them where they are. And even as practice owners, maintaining some success and, listen, especially if you work in a smaller town where people know what car you drive or where your home is and this sort of thing, I think we're very modest about those things. And I love that about veterinarians. I love that we're modest about that. But at the same time, we do have to have a successful business, because part of the purpose of having a successful business and the part of the purpose of having positive cash flow is to make sure that you can pay your staff correctly. It's to make sure you can invest in the equipment so that you can provide a higher standard of care. You need to have that success in order to reinvest back into your business to then perpetuate the kind of model of practice that you want to employ.
Was there a situation where that started to help your mindset when you looked at it? Because again, you were the one who was at the clinic all the time and you enjoyed it. But again, like you said, you do need to know that this is a business and the financial success of that business means this, right? Was that natural?
Yeah, I think my circumstance was a little bit unique. in that my boss at that time, another veterinarian, had made some promises of opportunities for me. And those promises just never came to be. It was one of the reasons why I left and went to England, was that those promises weren't being met. As a matter of fact, what was really interesting, when I had gone to England, he ended up having to hire 2 veterinarians to cover the workload that I had given up, and was not happy about that, as you can well imagine, from a cost perspective. And so he and his wife flew all the way to England to ask me to come back. So that's how serious that situation was back home. And the problem was that when I came back, we just fell back into the same old routine, and nothing ever became of it. And I realized that that wasn't where my opportunity was going to be. And so I just needed to make the decision to move on. The problem with that, and I would encourage this to, some of your viewers, especially the younger viewers, make that decision sooner, not later. It was about 6 years for me to make that decision. That's a long time for me to give, my energy to, my passion to in those situations. Not to say that there wasn't some value in the mentorship and those things that came along with those things. But, I would encourage people that, if you're thinking about the idea of moving on and starting your own practice, I think that's a very positive thing to do. You'll never regret doing it too early. You might regret doing it too late.
The episode that just came out this week, actually, she said that was one of her pieces of advice of don't wait too long to leave a practice. If you know it's not a good fit, find a new fit. She said that contributed probably to her burnout, where she got to the point where she just wanted to leave the profession entirely. So yeah, as you mentioned, there's a lot of things to do in this profession. So please don't waste your energy in the wrong fit.
Yeah, absolutely. And people need to keep that front of mind. And it's easy to lose focus on that because we do get buried in what we do. And we're very loyal to our commitments as veterinarians. So when we've got a clientele base, and that clientele base is harboring the patients that we look after, some of those are chronic conditions that we may be looking after. So we're seeing them pretty regularly. There's an extremely strong bond that we have in those circumstances, and high level of obligation that we're taking into those circumstances as well. And so that decision to leave is not an easy one, because we don't feel like we're just leaving, our employer. We don't feel like we're just leaving the practice. Sometimes we feel like we're abandoning our clients and our patients. And that's the hard part. And so I think I understand why people sometimes put those things on hold.
Yeah. So you're building all these practices. How do you start learning about things outside of the clinic? Like you become a president of a pharmaceutical company, you start supporting different startups. How does this all happen?
How does this all happen? That's a really good question. I think part of it was that I was already getting involved in some of the associations already while I was a practice owner. So I'd been involved in some of our provincial associations here, as well as our regulatory bodies as well. So that was getting me a little bit of exposure out there. Have you ever heard of the term monkey branching? Have you ever heard this term before?
No, I can kind of imagine what it might mean.
So monkey branching oftentimes is usually referring to relationships, and how sometimes when people are moving on to a relationship, they're still hanging on to the old one before they move on to the new one. This is not a good thing, obviously. But you know what? I think you can apply that same thing to career moves. I think what happens is that just like these veterinarians who are feeling this profound responsibility to clients and patients and don't want to leave their practice and start on their own, that's the branch that they're hanging on to. They can't let go of that branch. And I think one of the things I would encourage people is that there are plenty of branches to grab onto. And sometimes you need to take a little bit of a risk to find out what is out there to do that. And I think when we're so hyper-focused in day-to-day, and listen, we work hard as veterinarians, the long hours, our stress levels are like an ECG. When we're going through that, the last thing we want to do at the end of the day necessarily is think about the next best thing. We're just looking to kind of revive and obviously find some downtime, cover, and then get back to it. For me, I couldn't do that on my own. So for me, sorry, I got a little bit emotional there. For me, I needed a reminder I needed somebody to tap me on the shoulder. I needed somebody to do that. It was my wife who did that, who eventually said, hey, listen, you're too engrossed with this. And it's really taking you away from all of these other really important things in life, including me and your kids. And so that was a little bit of a wake up call for me. And I think part of that is because, and maybe this is a little bit generational, but part of that is also this feeling of responsibility to the people that you care for in your personal life as well. But, there's two different kinds of presence, Megan. One of them is actual physical presence, and the other one is metaphorical presence. And even though I could be present on occasion, I wasn't always present psychologically, because we're always in the clinic. We're always thinking about that patient. We're thinking about that client, dealing with some business problems, bad Google review, a staff member who's sick, whatever the case may be. There's just so many different things that you're constantly dealing with. And so to get back to your question was, how does all of this kind of blossom out? I let go of the branch. And in 2020, I sold my 5 practices that I had at that time. And when I sold my practices, you have to understand that this was prior to 2021. Everybody knows that in 2021, there was quite a lot of practices bought in that particular year at some extremely favorable rates. So I didn't sell my practice for money. I sold my practice for work-life balance. I sold my practice for personal reasons. That allowed me to get out from underneath the roof of the animal hospital. And of course, part of that, there's a little bit of grief that comes with that, because clinical practice is what I live for. But what I gained was tremendous. My boys at that particular time, I'm trying to think they were about 12 and 10 at the time. And so it was a great time in their lives for kind of dad to kind of get more deep into the picture and spend a lot more time with them. And I got to see them grow up through their high school years, which has been fantastic. But what it really did is it really opened up the door. It was amazing how many people recognized me as a person that would be valuable in many other different kinds of roles. The difference is that I've done such a better job at developing boundaries. And I think that's really the key. The other thing I've recognized is how valuable we are, those of us that carry this DVM degree or VMD degree behind your name. This is a very valuable tool. And so there's lots of different groups out there that want us. They need us. And so I think it's also about understanding your value as a person and then leveraging. And so that's how these things kind of came to be. And of course, the first company that I started after I sold my practice was a company called My Vet Group. And My Vet Group is a financial fiduciary. So we're a financial advisory service. And like most things, when you start a company, oftentimes it's because you've recognized a gap or you've recognized a problem. There's something to solve. And that was part of what I wanted to do. I wanted to solve a problem because there were things that I was seeing in the marketplace that didn't always make sense to me. There were a lot of people selling practices, but they weren't necessarily getting the terms that they wanted, or there were certain aspects in that deal that were disadvantageous to them and that sort of thing. There was imbalance of power in these negotiations. But that wasn't even the biggest thing. The biggest thing, Megan, was there's a lot of people who wanted to sell, and I don't think they wanted to sell. And there's a lot of people who were burnt out and tired and exhausted, and they made decisions when they were under a state of duress, and they shouldn't have done that. So part of my pillar for our company is we try to help all veterinarians at all stages of their veterinary journey, whether they're an associate looking to buy into a practice, whether they're an existing practice looking to expand and grow, or whether they're a practice that's looking for transition and succession. I want people to sort of rediscover and make sure that the decisions that they're making are the decisions that they truly want at the base of their heart. One of my favorite sayings, by the way, is contrast is the mother of clarity. And people probably get tired of me saying that because I say it a lot. But I say it because I think it's important. In order for you to know what choices to make, you need to know what options you have. And so part of that is kind of laying that out for people, getting them to kind of understand things a little bit better. And I think that's super duper important. So that's kind of where it all started. And then what happens is you start speaking at conferences, you start networking with a lot of different people. You start engaging on different boards and people start going, hey, you know what? I've got an idea. And it's amazing how many times, and I would say probably all 5 of the companies that I am currently an equity partner in all situations, almost all of them were created through a basic collaboration like the discussion we're having right now. Just fellow people getting together, having a great discussion and going, oh, I love that idea. That's a wonderful idea. I wonder if we can make a business. Like that sounds like a really cool thing to do. And that's fun. It's fun. And you know what? It fits. It fits because, one of the things you asked me is, kind of what stimulated, owning these practices. And I think for me personally, a huge driver for me, it's actually not financial. My huge driver is creativity. I like taking and making something of nothing. You just did this past week. Congratulations. But the point being is that this company didn't exist at some point in time.
Yeah.
And now this company exists. And there's something incredibly fulfilling about doing something like that. All 5 of my practices were de novo. They were all startups. All 5 of these companies are brand new companies. So it's really fun to find a niche, to find a need, to solve problems, and contribute positively to a profession that I love.
I totally relate. And even going back to practice ownership, having the ability to have more impact in decisions that are made. I just wrote an article about how needed the veterinary perspective is in the pet industry, and that people are very interested to hear your thoughts. Anywhere that animals are impacted, veterinarians need to have a voice there. So that just really opens.
Thank you for saying that. That's the perfect segue. Thank you very much. It's funny you say that because, 3 of the companies I work with are in the AI space. 2 of them in particular, NextVet, which is headed by Dr. Gerard O'Leary. He's a brilliant young man out of the University of Toronto. We have a laboratory on College Street out of the university. And then also I'm working with a great group of guys out of California. It's Richard Gebhardt, John Corsale, and Todd Tams. And these guys are really hyper-focused on access to care and communication and that sort of thing. And so these are really wonderful people that are focused, again, on some of the important things that we need to do as we're seeing technology progress. And so what you said, which I totally agree with, I just wrote an article for Praxis Magazine, and the title of that article was Orientation Over Acceleration. We're coming into an age right now where technology is advancing faster than the regulatories that govern. And this is a little bit problematic. And the reason it's problematic is because it doesn't give us sort of some ethical and moral guidelines for these things. And so to your point, which I 100% agree with, veterinarians need to participate. We need veterinarians to be involved in these particular situations. I was at a meeting, this is a little bit scary, but I was at a business meeting, and these were people that were involved, and I won't say what particular company or what particular realm because it would give it away, but I was involved in a large dinner meeting with 60 people that were present, heavily involved in this veterinary industry. And of the 60 people, Megan, I was the only veterinarian in the room. To me, that's problematic. As veterinarians, if we really want to steer this profession in a particular way and hold to a very specific ethos, we need to participate in things. And so I think that's another reason why I really have focused on, a diversification of what I do. It's making sure that I've got, sort of dangly arms into a few different things just to sort of, get a little bit of control, try to get a little bit of say. And I think that's super important. I would encourage, young veterinarians out there as well to be involved with that as well.
Also, a lot of the businesses that you're a part of directly impact the veterinary professional. So if they don't have a connection to the audience, the veterinary professional, then you can't actually make a good solution because you don't know your audience. So yeah, if they aren't involved, you don't have a good product, or at least it's not going to be as good as it could be. You have very smart people who are non-veterinarians. I want to give them credit, but it's a unique perspective that only a veterinarian can share.
It is a unique perspective. And you and I touched on it a few minutes ago where we said that it's a relationship business first. And the problem with the word relationship is it doesn't show up on an Excel document. And, when I talk about this, especially when I'm doing a particular conference, for example, when I'm talking about evaluating, for example, a business, when I use that word evaluation, Megan, let's be clear, I'm not talking about its monetary value. I'm just talking about an assessment. And so I'm going to back you up to a little bit of clinical medicine just for a second. Because when you and I create an assessment, we go through a subjective and an objective analysis to get to that assessment. We don't just do the objective, right? So as an analogy, it's not just based upon an Excel document or a CBC in a biochemistry. We would fail a lot if we hinged all of our assessments on just a blood sample. We need that subjectiveness to get a really clear understanding as to what the needs are, what's the assessment, what are the differentials, how are we going to take our plans moving forward, what's the next step in the diagnostic process, and what does our treatment plan look like? Clinics and business are no different. It's exactly the same. And so I think that when groups and individuals, whether it be an individual practice owner or whether it be a group of people who are not from our industry, are only looking at objective data, they're not getting the complete picture. And that's a problem. And you and I as clinicians know that problem.
Anytime you deal with a living thing, they're each unique. They write their own story. There's not just one standard textbook or a set of data sets that works. You've mentioned AI. This is why AI can't do everything without us, right? Is like you have to have the human being who can actually see the full picture and put it together.
Yeah, I like that. This is one of Gerard's famous sayings, is that he likes to say that, AI won't replace veterinarians, but veterinarians who use AI will certainly be those veterinarians who will be on the forefront. But I think at the same time, we still need to be cognizant of the orientation, the direction, the ethics and the morals that go into what we're building. I think it's really important that we do that. If you take nuclear energy, you can use it to power a city and you can use it to destroy a city. So just because you've developed it doesn't mean you should do it. And so I think that that's something to always, actually the saying goes something like this. I think it is, capability isn't permissibility. And so I think that that's an important thing to kind of bear in mind. Just because we can do it doesn't mean we should. And so I think that it's important to do. Here's where I think AI is super interesting moving forward, especially when we're talking about things like transcription in particular. When you and I are practicing, typically what I would say we're doing is very episodic. If it's an annual exam, we see them once a year. If it's an illness problem, they come in when they are ill with that particular ailment. So it's at a point in time. Same thing with something like a blood test. That blood test is at a point in time. But there are so many hours, minutes, days of the year where we're not seeing that pet, where we don't know what they're doing. We don't know what's going on. And, the one tool that we started with in veterinary medicine about 30 years ago was the Holter monitor, right? This was really the first tool that came out where we were starting to do continuous monitoring. And of course, in human medicine, when we're talking about human wearables in particular, they've kind of taken off on this because we've got the Whoop, we've got the Fitbit, we've got the Apple Watch. We have all of these tools that they're doing continuous monitoring on us all the time. And we're learning from that. We're learning about not just when the pet is sick or the person is sick. We're learning what they look like when they're healthy, or what might preface the sickness, or what might happen immediately after a sickness. We're learning a lot more. And that's one of the things I'm very excited about when it comes to AI, is that I think there's a lot more to learn. When we look at something like a continuous glucose monitor, that's so much different than when we're doing points in time, pinpricking a cat's ear or taking a blood sample from a dog, where it's like every hour, if you can get it every hour, while they're not overly unstressed within your clinic, within the hours of the day that you're trying to work. It's not an impossibility, but it's an incomplete test. So now that we have continuous glucose monitors, we have the ability to actually run this through under normal circumstances, under no duress. And we're seeing all of these different activities that are going. Matter of fact, we can get to a point where we can tell you exactly what treat was given when, just by the continuous glucose monitor, right? So there's lots to be learned in these kinds of things, and I'm excited for that, because I think that will lead us to a lot more knowledge and a lot more data that we can use to our advantage in the clinics. There's even groups like Pointer, for example, and Pointer is working on predictive healthcare, which I think is going to be big in the future as well. As we kind of move forward, we're going to gather a lot of data that's going to give us a really good sense as to what the risks are on a per patient basis. Not to necessarily say that the outcome is imminent, but it's going to at least give us some guidelines in terms of what to do. The other reason I like that is I like putting a little bit of the power in the hands of the clients to some degree, not from a diagnostic standpoint, but just from the standpoint of being actively involved with their pet's health. I think there's something really, really positive about that. And I think that as veterinarians, if we're looking into the future, sometimes we always kind of keep the clients a little bit at arm's length a little bit. And I think now into this new area of technology, clients have access to a lot of information. So we really need to partner, I think, with clients a lot more than we have in the past. We need to see them as part of the process, that they're going to be a lot more involved than they ever used to be.
They even have a term for it now, collaborative care.
There you go.
And almost full circle too, going back to some of these different business models that veterinary practices can have to maybe better facilitate the collaborative care approach, I think is great. As you said, there's lots of different business models out there. You had mentioned some fail and some do well. And I think some of it is also knowing who your target client is and making sure that you find them and they know that you're there. Because, if you just say my audience are pet owners, that's like 1 billion people. They're all different. They all want different things. And so, but I think if you do look across the board, they all really love their pets. And I think more and more as time has gone by, I think they really want to understand and be more involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there was I can't remember if it was Isaac Newton or Thomas Edison who said, if you tell about something to somebody, they forget it. If you show them, they remember it. But if you involve them, they understand it. And I think that that's what you're referring to. Like we're getting to a stage now where we're really needing to involve them. The other point that you made, which I thought was interesting, is, the veterinary profession is no longer this sort of ubiquitous model. It's very different. The kinds of practices that are out there, everything from general to specialty, emergency, urgent care, you name it. And then the ownership models that are out there as well, whether it be independent, corporately owned, venture capitalists, hybrid models. There's lots of the different ownership models. And to your point, there's social economic differences between different regions and cities. There's different perspectives. We have more people. And, when we look at the United States and Canada in particular, we have more people moving into our countries who come from other countries who have different viewpoints on what animal husbandry looks like or what a human animal bond should be defined as. So there's a lot of these different factors that kind of come into play, which we need to kind of stop trying to make broad stroke recommendations to the profession as a whole. And I think we really need to start getting almost onto a per clinic basis. It's no longer, here's the problem the profession faces and we should all do this. It's really not like that anymore. It's more now we need to look at this particular practice in this particular location, with that particular group of clients, this particular group of staff members. And what are our problems? Let's do a SWOT analysis. Let's figure out the strengths of this company. Let's figure out the weaknesses. Let's figure out the opportunities. And let's go through that as an individual practice and work it out that way. I think it needs to be more individualistic. And to your point, that is coming to the client. We're meeting the client where they are.
Which hopefully is exciting to our profession, because that also means there's lots of different styles that can fit you and what you're interested in.
That's it. That's right.
I'm sure you have conversations about that when you said, you help counsel everything from people looking to purchase a practice to, sell the practice. Those are probably conversations that you're having with the people trying to purchase, trying to understand them and what their goals are and, how they envision it and make sure that all aligns.
I just had an interview 2 days ago with a gentleman out of Missouri, a young associate who's worked in a couple of different practices. He would like to buy a practice. He doesn't want to start one from scratch. And, the first question I asked him is, what's your vision? Like, what's your vision of this practice? How do you see this practice running? What is it that you would like to do? And I think that's kind of where it's got to start. You got to figure out what your particular vision is. And again, there's no broad stroke answer to this. Your vision can be something completely different than somebody else's.
And I think it's okay to be open to having that change.
Oh, for sure. It changes a lot.
Sometimes I don't want people to think, okay, I have this great vision and it's all, going to happen. And then when it doesn't happen, you feel like you failed. That's not necessarily the case. You're going to learn about things you didn't know beforehand. You're going to have changing situations. So your vision may change, your goals may change.
For
So
sure.
to be open to growth and learning along the way.
You have to be able to pivot. And I think that's another advantage, of course, for independent practices versus larger platforms, is that individual practices have that ability. They have that ability that they can pivot very quickly. When they see a problem, they can literally institute change immediately to deal with that particular problem. That's a huge advantage. That's much more difficult for a large platform of practices to do when they see a problem. Veterinarians need to obviously embrace that. And to your point, I think we shouldn't be afraid of change. Change is okay. Change is good. There's a lot of really positive things when it comes to change. And so I think that, people just really need to, be open-minded and let go of that branch.
Yay, full circle. I love full circle moments. Well, I feel like we could talk for a very long time, but is there anything just on the top of your head that you're like, oh man, I would feel like we have totally missed the boat if I don't talk about this?
You know what? As you go through your journey, and we all have different journeys in veterinary medicine, there is no wrong journey to begin with. Let me just start by saying that. And I think as we lead as veterinarians, as we participate in all of these other integrative businesses that are coming into our space, we don't always need to lead from what we've done right. I think it's also important that we need to learn from what we've done wrong. And I think that becomes really, really important. And I think ultimately it's up to us, as veterinarians, it's up to us. If we have a particular vision for what our vocation is going to look like in 5 or 10 years ago, don't leave it to somebody else. Participate, be a part of it, and become part of the change and make it what you want it to be.
It is a call to act, to get involved, to do something. And it can be something that you're interested in. There's something you're interested in that needs you. So absolutely. I always end on one last question, and that is, what is something you're very grateful for right now? First thing that comes to your mind.
Grateful for my time with my family.
How old are your boys now?
18 and 16. Yes, I'm losing one this year. My oldest one is going off to university. So we're going to have some big changes at home, but it's also extremely exciting to see him have his opportunities to grow, and also our opportunity to watch that and take joy in his journey.
That was Dr. Mark de Wolde, and this was such a rich discussion that I hope it leaves you thinking. Please check out the podcast guide to hold on to these key takeaways and have questions to apply them to your journey. So the guide and everything we discussed today are all in the show notes. If this episode resonated with you, please subscribe and share it with someone in veterinary medicine who you think would appreciate it. And until next time, keep reimagining what's possible in veterinary life.